All right. How's everyone doing? Thank you all for attending the talk. I know it's the last slot of the conference, so thank you all so much for sticking around. My name is James Sullivan, but in the work world, I actually go by Sully. I'd like to start off this talk the same way I start off any first date. I ramble about myself and try to convince you all that I'm qualified to be here. So I've been a product designer for the past 7 years, based out of Richmond, Virginia. In a past life, I worked at CarMax on their design system team, which was the first time I was properly introduced to accessibility by a developer named Robertson Odom. Back in 2018, I revamped CarMax's color system with an accessibility-first approach and actually presented that research journey back at AXCON 2021. Today, I'm a senior product designer at WillowTree, which is based out of Charlottesville, Virginia. If you're a designer or developer using Figma, you may have used a plugin our head of design, Alex Carr, built. The plugin is called Contrast. Right now, it's one of, if not one of the most used plugin to check for color contrast accessibility. And for the past few months, I've had the privilege of being one of the designers to spearhead the next version of the plugin, which incorporates the Accessible or Advanced Perceptual Contrast Algorithm, or APCA. The APCA itself is the proposed candidate to replace the current way we determine accessibility in regards to color and typography. And today I'm going to scratch the surface of what this algorithm brings to the table. So this is demystifying the APCA. So by the end of this talk, I want everyone to walk away with 3 points in mind. 1, the APCA is a new approach to color contrast, which incorporates font size and font weight. 2, because of this new approach, the current WCAG 2.2 standards do not ensure accessibility if and when the APCA comes out. And 3, worst comes to worst, and nothing I say today makes any sense at all, the contrast plugin in Figma will guide you to creating accessible APCA-approved designs. As for the talk itself, first, I'm going to walk through the current state of color contrast. Most of the information won't be new, but it'll be important when we dive into the APCA. Afterwards is where we begin to scratch the surface of what the APCA is and how it differs from 2.2 standards. Then, for the final part of the talk, I'm going to showcase the latest developments of the contrast plugin. Before we jump in, I do have a disclaimer. The APCA itself, it's still in the works, so information I'll be providing is based on what exists as of right now. Though it's slated to be part of WCAG 3, nothing is set in stone at the moment. That does mean if you're watching this talk at a later date, the information might be a little bit outdated. Okay, so let's jump right in by first talking about the current state of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and how color contrast is determined. Today, currently, right now, we determine accessibility in color through the contrast ratio. If you've been exposed to design accessibility in the past few years, this term's not going to be new to you, but for those that are new to design and accessibility, let's just briefly go over what that's going to mean. So color contrast refers to how dark or how light one color is compared to another. Black, in comparison to white, has the highest amount of contrast. The contrast ratio is how we express how different those two colors are from each other. At the highest level, white text on a black background or black text on a white background has a color contrast of 21:1. Then at the lowest level, black text on a black background or really any color upon itself has a contrast ratio of 1:1. The higher the ratio, the more different those two colors are. It's a plain and simple way to say it. And in the world of digital design, there are certain ratios we're required to, or at least strongly encouraged to hit. At the lowest level is 3:1. That would be used for icons, large text. 4.5:1 for regular text, and it's the ratio that we're looking to hit about 90% of the time. But if you want to hit the gold standard of text contrast, you're looking for 7:1. So when we designers actually ask ourselves, is it accessible? We're actually referring to these ratios. One thing that you're going to notice is throughout this whole talk, I'm not going to mention single A, double A, or triple A ratings. The reason why is because it's easier to explain the translation between contrast ratios and what the APCA is proposing instead of trying to answer what is the new A, what is the new AA. So that's why I'm focusing on 3, 4.5, and 7. Now, if you're in this talk, those ratios are probably not new to you, but maybe something in the next part is. Question, what do these 3 text and background combinations have in common? At first sight, it doesn't seem like anything, but in fact, each of these combinations has a 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio, and that's not an accident. There's a reason that these same color contrast comes down to a systematic approach to color. Let's look a little bit under the hood on these color combinations. Here are those same colors represented in 3 different color spaces. And there's a certain number that I actually want everyone to focus on, and it's the first number within the CIELAB color space. It's called the perceptual lightness value. If you've delved into color and accessibility, the lab color space has probably come up a couple of times. And by looking at perceptual lightness of these colors, we're able to understand accessibility at a deeper level. So what do I mean by that? Well, colors in digital design are tied to a singular lightness value. So what would happen if we actually looked at these 3 color combinations as data points on a graph? Let's set our x-axis to the lightness value of the background colors and our y-axis as a lightness value of our foreground colors. With just 3 data points, we have no apparent pattern. But with WCAG 2.2, the contrast ratio is the same even if the foreground and background are reversed. So black on white is the same as white on black, and these combinations are no different. If we invert and reuse the exact same points, now we have a bit of a pattern emerging. Those 2 lines represent the 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio threshold. Everything on this line or inside the upper right or bottom left corners are 4.5 or higher. And we can actually apply this exact same process in order to get the 3 to 1 and 7 to 1 thresholds as well. So what did we just learn? Here's the main takeaway. By looking at the perceptual lightness values in the lab color space, we can accurately map out contrast ratio thresholds. We're going to come back to this graph later on, but let's start scratching the surface by looking at examples of why the APCA is a needed move. So for the next part of the talk, we're going to get a little bit interactive here. Before I explain what the APCA is, I want you to see how the algorithm might affect current state designs. We're going to compare and contrast what passes in 2.2 with what passes in the APCA. And I want you to understand that adhering to the current contrast ratios will not guarantee APCA compatibility. All right, so on the screen is a QR code that you can scan with your phone. If you have the Figma mobile app, it'll open up the prototype in the app. But if you don't have the app, it should open up in your mobile browser. But everything in the prototype will be on the slides, so you will not be missing out on anything that it isn't in the presentation. It's just so you can see the examples in a proper setting. And I'm going to keep that prototype QR code in the bottom left corner of the following slides. All right, let's jump in. So here are some examples of text and color combinations that pass WCAG 2.2 standards. From left to right, we have a 3 to 1 ratio using 24 pixel font size. Then we have a 4.5 with 16 pixel. And lastly, a 7 to 1 with 12 pixels. And I'm going to use all regular font weights for each example, just because it's the most common one. And then for those of you using the prototype, you can actually tap through the different ratios using the selector at the bottom. You can also use the left and right arrows at the top to cycle through the APCA scenarios. Okay, so here's the kicker. Each of these examples would fail the APCA standards. Let's go through each example with a little bit more nuance and understand why. In our 3 to 1 example, our text is actually considered large text. So why does it fail the APCA standards? Well, color contrast is just the first step. There are font size and font weight minimums based on your contrast. So what options do we have? Well, in the APCA, if you want to keep using a 24 pixel font size, I could lighten the background significantly, but that could change the feel of the design completely. Or I could lighten the text color and maintain the background color, which would be closer to the original design, but maybe it's using an off-brand color. If I was willing to change the font size to maintain the color usage, then by APCA silver standards, I'd have to increase the type to 106 pixels. It's quite a big departure, I know, but here are some of the options, right? It could get really tricky if you are using an established design system. You're potentially adding a new font size, maybe you're adding new color swatches. And as a former design system designer, adding each adds complexity, it adds new governance. And this is just one example. So imagine looking at an entire website. Okay, on to the 4.5 example. Once again, this design would fail the APCA standards. If I want to maintain the 16 pixel font size, I can't do that without changing the foreground and background colors. Just making the background white isn't enough. I need to make the background white and darken the text. But again, I could increase the font size. It would go up to 21 pixels, which isn't too bad. Luckily, with this example, it doesn't change up the design too much, but let's look at the last one, okay? In our 7:1 ratio example, remember, 7:1 is considered high contrast in 2.2, but this design still fails APCA standards. So here's where things get a little bit spicy. If I want to use 12 pixel text size in the APCA, I have to increase the font weight to bold, and the text color would have to go all the way to white. That's the smallest amount of change I need to do to make 12 pixel text APCA accessible. But maybe I can increase the text size. If I want to maintain the colors I have, I need to increase the text size to 40. That's pretty jarring. Think of designs where 12 pixel text is used because of the limited amount of space in the design. And I know even discussing 12 pixel text at an accessibility conference has a little bit of irony, since the general guidance for web design is to start around 16 pixels. In reality, though, we designers use 12 pixel text a lot. Small labels, legal disclaimers, captions on webs or apps, just as a couple of examples. So as you can see, this is where the current state of color contrast and what the APCA may recommend see the differences. The big takeaway is that adhering to the current WCAG 2.2 ratios will not guarantee APCA compatibility. There is much more nuance being added to the system. All right, now that we've seen how the APCA may change the current standards, let's delve into what the APCA actually is. First and foremost, it's the accessible, sometimes you will see the word Advanced Perceptual Contrast Algorithm. Again, it is the proposed candidate to replace the current way we determine accessibility in regards to typography. There are 3 proposed levels of conformance: bronze, silver, and gold. They do build upon each other, similar to WCAG 2.2, but it's not going to be as simple as make the contrast higher. Gold standard, it's a rigorous amount of conformance, which incorporates the individual X heights of some of the typefaces. Meanwhile, bronze, it's a beginner guideline, but takeaways might not be actionable. So for today, I'm actually going to talk about the APCA through the silver level of conformance. It's a good middle ground for us to sink our teeth into, but since it incorporates most of bronze level, it's going to set you up for success if you ever want to go for gold. To begin, I'm actually going to make a series of statements about the APCA, and then we're going to dissect each part of those statements. So, number 1, the combination of foreground and background colors determine the lightness contrast, or LC value, which is on a scale of -108 to +106. 2, the use case of your text determines the minimum LC value you need to have. And 3, The minimum font size requirement is based on the LC value of your text and the font weight you are using. Before we dissect these statements, I think now is a good time to just reiterate that WCAG 3's timeline, it's not set. We don't know when the APCA will formally come out, nor do we know what state it's going to come out in. So this information may change a little bit or a lot over the coming years. All right, let's start to dissect now. The combination of foreground and background colors determine the lightness contrast. The terms foreground and background colors remain the same, so that's pretty good. And I know the word lightness has appeared a lot in this presentation, so bear with me, but there is one more term that uses it, and that is the lightness contrast. Instead of a contrast ratio, there is a lightness contrast value, or LC value. The scale of -108 to +106 refers to the fact that your LC, if your LC is from -108 to -1, it means that the background is darker than the foreground. And if your LC is from +1 to +106, it means that the foreground is lighter, the background is lighter than the foreground. Sorry, I get those two mixed up. Okay, so here's the catch. A -53 LC is equal to a +53 LC. They'll have the same minimum font size requirement. One of them just has a dark background and one of them has a light background. But this does not mean that you can reverse your foreground and background colors and expect the same LC value. That perfect inverse property from WCAG 2.2, that's gone. The contrast ratio from 2.2 is the same, but for the APCA, the LC is going to differ. In this example, it differs by just about 2 points. So this is the first layer of the APCA. What is the lightness contrast between the foreground and background elements? On to the next statement. The use case of your text determines the minimum LC value you need to have. This part is the most overwhelming, so I'm going to go through it pretty slowly. Let's start with the use case of your text. Semantics are going to come into play here. Whether you consider your text as a headline, maybe it's body copy, maybe it's placeholder text, or maybe it's disabled text, even iconography. Each use case is going to have a different minimum LC value. This is the nuance that I was talking about earlier. These use cases are divided up by 5 levels, and I'm going to go through them one by one. Starting off, level 1. LC90 is the level that requires the highest amount of contrast. The bronze conformance standards state that LC90 is the preferred level for fluent text and columns of body text with a font no smaller than 18 pixels, with a weight of 300, or 14 pixel with a weight of 400, or non-body text with a font no smaller than 12 pixel. It is also the recommended minimum for extremely thin fonts with a minimum of 24 pixel at a weight of 200. LC90 is the suggested maximum for fonts greater than 36 pixel at a 700 font weight and large areas of color. So when I decided to title my talk, Demystify the APCA, these guidelines were what I was referring to. Fluent text and columns of text are not common terms in the digital design world. Columns in the sense of a grid, yes, but columns of text, not so much. So in order to demystify, I'm going to give a suggestion, which are just my opinion on how to think about these levels. Think of LC90 as the preferred level for small body copy. Sentences, paragraphs, small labels. Ignore the font size and font weight requirements for now, okay? Going forward, I won't read the full bronze conformance guidelines since I'll have them up on the slides, but I will read out my suggestions. So LC75 is next. Bronze standard states it's the minimum level for columns of body text and any larger text where readability is important. My suggestion would be to think of LC75 as the approved level for small to medium body copy. I think it's beneficial to tie together LC90 and LC75, and I'll explain that during the dissection of the final statement. But for now, just keep in mind that both levels deal with body copy. LC60 is up next. Again, the bronze standards state here on the slide, but I'm just going to focus on one part. It's the sentence that says, in other words, text you want people to read. And that's actually where I'm going to stop. LC60 is the minimum for text you want people to read, plain and simple. LC45, the minimum for larger, heavier text, such as headlines and large text. LC45 is where things get a little bit murky. As someone that has worked in both the web and the app world, I don't expect users to ever read a full paragraph of text. I do tend to rely on them skimming headlines, so I at least consider headlines as text I want people to read. So my suggestion for this one would be use LC45 as a minimum for maybe decorative pull quotes, standalone headlines, but personally, I'm going to be looking at LC60 as my minimum. I think it'd be worth calling out, though, that LC45 as a minimum for very small iconography. And lastly, LC30, deemed as the absolute minimum for placeholder text, disabled text, and legal marks like copyright, trademark, or registration. So here's my final suggestion. As someone in the UX world, placeholder text and disabled text is 99% of the time text I want people to read. Placeholder text in form fields guides the user to understand how to best utilize the form field. Search bars are a great example of that. Disabled text on a button, that's going to help the user understand that their desired action requires an additional step before that button can become enabled. And lastly, the legal marks almost always inherit the color that it's attached to. So going into the designs and manually lightening those marks just because they can be lighter wouldn't be an effective use of time. All right, so those 5 levels make up the meat of the APCA. And again, my suggestions are just my opinions, but they have helped me understand the APCA from an actionable standpoint. Okay, thank you so much for bearing with that one. It's definitely the most overwhelming part of the APCA. So here's our final statement. The minimum font size requirement is based on the LC value of your text and the font weight you are using. This statement is going to actually be easier to visualize as a chart rather than me trying to describe with words. All the values I'm going to show you are going to be taken from the live APCA contrast calculator. So these numbers may change if the algorithm changes. Okay, let's create a table with the 5 main LC values on the y-axis and the standard font weight options on the x-axis. 100 is thin, 400 is normal, 700 is bold, and all the way up to 900 as heavy. In order to get the minimum font size requirement, we take a desired LC value. Let's use 75 as our example. Now, we need to cross-reference it with 400, or the normal font weight on the x-axis. The cell at this intersection will show the minimum font size required. This method specifically is what will get you the silver conformance level. The individual combination of LC plus font weight output, the minimum font size requirement. This table is actually why I avoided the font size and font weights when going through the bronze level conformance in the previous section. I do agree that it's easier to wrap your head around just a couple of font size and font weight minimums for a larger range of LC values. But when it comes to walking away with actionable steps, like something that you can actually use in Figma, it's easier to have the minimum requirements for every single LC value. I'd argue that having all the information accessible is better than having some of the information accessible. And one last point, I do want to make a pit stop at LC75 and LC90. During the last statement, I said it'd be beneficial to tie those two values together. What I meant by that is that the minimum font size requirement is the same from LC75 to 90. 16 is the minimum at 500 from LC75 to 90. 18 pixel is the minimum at 900 from 75 to 90. The font size requirement does not change even though you've increased your LC value. To be fair, light and normal font weights have a minimal change in requirements between the two. With extra light, it does have a 10 pixel difference, but I still think it'd be fair to deem one as the preferred level for body copy and the other as the approved level. It's only my really spicy take in this whole talk. And for those that know me, I really don't have a whole lot of spicy takes, if at all. Okay, so this brings it all home. With those three statements, you're on your way to fully understanding the APCA. Second to last part. We know how and what of the APCA, but I want to take you one level deeper in understanding. The more we understand, the less mysterious it is, right? So one of the big takeaways I want you all to walk away with is that lightness in the lab color space is still a useful indicator of what color combinations are accessible. It's not going to be as exact as 2.2, looking at those 5 key LC values through the lens of lightness, just so we can better understand how the APCA is different than 2.2. So let's go back to the chart that we had at the beginning of the talk. Here again, we have mapped out the background lightness on the x-axis and the foreground lightness values on the y-axis, with the 3 main WCAG 2.2 ratio lines. With everything that we learned about this talk, the question becomes, is there a similar chart, but instead of contrast ratios, we can see the threshold of those 5 key LC levels? And the answer is yes. In order to create this new chart, though, I couldn't just take randomized swatches of varying lightness values. Because the APCA takes hue into account, I had to take 24 individual hues and then sampled 9 swatches of each of them at lightness values of 10 all the way to 90, for a total of about 216 swatches. Then I took all these swatches, used each one as either the foreground or the background, documented their lightness value, and plotted it on the graph. Doing this helped me better understand how the hue affects lightness contrast. And while there is still nuance between the different hues, through my own personal testing, so again, it could be flawed, but I think it'd be fair to say that it has a nominal effect on the lightness contrast. It's usually between 0 to 4 points of difference. So for some quick math, 216 swatches used as both the background and foreground gave me a total of 46,656 points on a graph that I'm about to show. Let's bring back the 2.2 contrast ratio thresholds, and we'll overlay the average APCA lightness contrast lines. The reason I say average is because of the said nominal difference between the hues. All right, so for the purposes of the presentation, I'm going to say that this is just a stylized rather than 100% accurate. Also, I'm going to focus on lighter backgrounds, aka the upper right corner, so the graph doesn't get too busy. We'll start at the lowest contrast level and work our way up. Here is the LC30 line. So again, with those 46,000 data points, this is the average line of where combinations come out as having a lightness contrast of 30. The first thing that we can see is that the shape is pretty different than the 2.2 lines. It's a little bit more oval than circular. There's more leeway the lighter the background. LC45 is probably going to be one of the more interesting ones because it teeters on the line of 4.5 to 1. That's definitely going to help out when it comes to adjusting to the transition between 2.2 and the APCA. LC60 is mostly within the 4.5 to 1 line, but do remember that there are going to be font size minimums and font weight constraints. LC75, mostly within the 7:1 ratio with just a little bit of overhang. And then lastly, the LC90 line. It's in a league all of its own, takes up the smallest amount on the graph and has a little bit of wiggle room for color combinations. But if you're going to be using bright backgrounds for the most part, so you have a little bit of space. And then here are all the LC levels in full with both the light background, which we went over, as well as the dark backgrounds. It's not the easiest to see, but they actually aren't symmetrical. If you look at where LC30 begins, it's a telltale sign. When the background lightness is 0 or black, you start at a foreground with a lightness value of 50. But when the foreground lightness is 0, you need to start at a background with a lightness of 46. So here are the two charts actually put side by side. And there is an argument to be made that the APCA does allow for more color combinations because of the usable area being larger. But there's one more way I want to look at these graphs, and that's through the lens of allowable font size at the silver level of conformance. The black line is the 3:1 contrast ratio in WCAG 2.2, but we could also call the threshold for using 24 pixel or large size text. The purple area on the graph represents LC60 in the APCA, but it also represents the threshold for using 24 pixel size text at a normal font weight. So the usability of 24 pixel text is reduced by about 40%. And then if you increase the font weight to bold, you can actually reclaim some of those lost color combinations. So let's look at two more sizes. What about 16 pixel? In this example, the black line represents the 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio. While 16 pixel isn't called out specifically as normal text, it's generally considered the baseline size for digital design. The blue area of the graph represents LC90, which is specifically called out as the starting point for 16 pixel size text at a normal font weight. Here, the ability to use 16 pixel text is reduced by far more than 40%. The color combination options you have are going to drastically go down. Luckily, and you will notice a trend here, but increasing the font weight to bold will reclaim a lot of those lost options. But in design, much like the movie The Incredibles, when everything is bold, nothing is bold. And we're going to have to adjust for hierarchy of text. But let's look at one final example to drive this point home. Here, the black line represents the 7:1 contrast ratio. While technically you can use 12 pixel font size at a lower contrast ratio, let's say for the sake of this talk that designers only use 12 pixel font size when the ratio is 7:1 or above. It might be hard to see, but in the bottom left and upper right corners of the graph, those slivers are the allowable area for 12 pixel font size at bold. Not even at a regular font weight, it has to be bold. And while this is the silver level of conformance, it's still worth talking about just in case. We as designers are going to have to make some pretty big adjustments if our clients or companies want to adhere to silver level. All right, let's move on to the really cool part, the contrast plugin demonstration. Want to really give like a big shout out to the developer that helped this, Ashut Halevanyan. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But give me 1 second here while I switch up the screen sharing. Paul, am I looking good on time?
Sorry, I had to unmute. Yes, you're looking good on time. You've got about 5 more minutes, and then we'll take some questions.
All right. Are you able to see the Figma screen? I'm going to get a thumbs up. Okay, great. All right, so Here are the latest developments of the contrast plugin. I'm actually going to select a color here just so we can get started. But if you use the plugin, what you might be a little bit more familiar with is the WCAG 2.2 version of the plugin, where it just has normal text, large text, and graphics. What we've added now is an APCA beta for the algorithm. So if I toggle that on, what it's going to do is transform from looking at the contrast ratio to the lightness contrast. So because the APCA is so text heavy driven, let's take a look at what text is going to look like now. So in this example, I have text that has a lightness contrast of about 35. So that falls into like one of the lower ranges, right? When we're looking at those LC values, it's on the lower range. What the plugin is going to do is tell you how to make it go from inaccessible to accessible. A couple of ways it's going to do that. Number one, it's going to tell you the lightness contrast on the scale of 0 to 108. Next up is going to be the font weight. Those standard font weight sizes of 100 to 900, those are going to be built into the plugin, which is going to be great. So here, I'm using a regular font weight at about 20 pixels. Because my font weight is in the blue, that means I'm good to go. But my font size is in the red, which means that I need to increase my font size to a more acceptable, AKA a APCA approved level. So let's do that in Figma by just bumping up the font size, and you're actually going to see the plugin change. That arrow indicator in font size is going to move as you increase the font size. And now I'm going to cheat a little bit and bump it up to 93. So if I go from 93 to 94, boom, I'm now in the accessible range. And I can use this for something like non-content text. Then again, if I want to actually increase the color while still maintaining the size, I can do that with the color picker in Figma. And I'm actually going to see that first arrow in lightness contrast go to the right. So as I change my color, great. Now I have more lightness contrast. And what you actually, one thing I do want to call it is as I go from a light color to a darker color, the font size slider also changes. As I go to a darker color, I have more availability to use smaller font sizes. So this plugin is going to really help guide you to know, okay, if I have an LC of this, a font weight of this, what does my font size need to be the minimum accessible level for the APCA? So we spent a couple of months on this research for the plugin. It is internal beta right now, so it means that it has a couple of bugs that we need to fix. But for the most part, we do hope to get this out. I'm going to say like 2 months. I'm going to hold myself to that. About 2 months, I want to get this out into the public, into everyone else's hands as another beta. That way we can receive public feedback to see if it's really helping out designers, developers, and anyone else that really cares about accessibility and the APCA. All right, that is the end of my talk. I will stop sharing now. Just want to say, again, thank you all for letting me do this talk. I'm ready for questions.
All right, and boy, do we have questions. I can see why this is a talk about the importance of demystifying this. Let me start. I've tried to consolidate some of the questions, and so I'm just going to jump right into it. Some of the questions come from the perspective of, wow, this is a big change. How are we going to deal with it? And the 3 points I'll mention here are, what about dark mode? What about offering multiple contrast options? And what about the requirement to allow different font sizes, bigger or smaller? And if you forget one of those 3 points, I can come back, but it's dark mode, multiple contrast options, and font adjustments.
Let's see. Okay, so dark mode, it's actually going to be easier. So that scale of 108, 106, it actually gives more leeway when the background is darker. So I actually wouldn't worry too much about dark mode. That's not going anywhere. But again, like you just do have to be cognizant of making sure that the color combinations are correct. My concern with dark mode may be, though, that you do need high contrast, even though the purpose of dark mode is to kind of like, I'm going to say reduce the contrast so it's not as, jarring. Let's say I'm on my phone in bed at night. I don't want the screen to be, blasting my eyes with a lot of light. So you do want to like reduce the contrast. So that is where text is going to become a little bit more jarring. It's going to have to get a little bit brighter in dark mode for it to pass with the APCA. In terms of font sizing, so as we saw, like in some of the examples, like I had to go from 12 pixel to 40 or 24 to like 106. That one's going to be tough. I'm not going to lie. The font size is going to be tough. So that's why I showed the options of, maybe you lighten your background and darken your text, or you lighten your text and you darken your background. It is going to be pretty hard to figure out, okay, if I have a design system now and I know what my acceptable pairings are, how is that going to translate to the APCA? That one, I almost want to do an entire talk on its own about how design systems and something like tokens are going to have to account for the correct pairing of font size, font weight with the correct pairing of color combination and how that intersection is going to happen. And then, yes, what is the third point? I did forget.
The multiple contrast options, if you're offering them, how do you take that into account with these different requirements?
Yeah. With the multiple contrast options. So it is easier when you have a company with a brand and you're like, okay, I have to use this color. That way it does become a little bit easier. Like you can actually lock in one of those variables, right? While doing this research, I kept on thinking about it as it's multivariable calculus. You got 3 variables that are constantly moving around. If you can lock one of them in, that's great. And so if you're using brand colors, that's great that you can lock in at least the foreground or the background. But then when it does come to the other combinations, you do have a little bit more freedom. It does have, quote unquote, like more usable area, right? When we looked at that graph of 2.2 versus the APCA, there is a larger usable area. So you do have a little bit more freedom to play there. But my recommendation would be like, set one of them in stone, set the foreground or the background like as like a locked in variable. And that way you can play with just like one of the colors. And again, the plugin can help you understand like, okay, if I just change it a little bit, maybe I get to the correct LC value that I need. I don't know if that answers the question, but again, it's a dialogue, Yeah,
and we'll go to some of the other questions. So several questions came to us about non-text elements, and they mentioned things like user interface components, iconography, charts, graphs, graphics. So do the guidelines apply there? Yes,
that's a really, really good question because I had that exact same question. What happens to the focus state? What happens to, I know there's no like specific guidance on like the hover versus pressed or like the default versus hover. We try to, say like it's a 3-to-1 ratio between default and hover. That's like a guideline really. Icon size, that one will have requirements. So LC45, that one was like the minimum for, I think it was like either 4 pixel or 2 pixel icon size. So basically like you're looking at a little bit more leeway, honestly, with icons. But when it comes to interactive elements, there's nothing there quite yet. So that's why I'm saying like it's still in flux, it's still moving around. Whether we get like 1-to-1 requirements between 2.2 and the APCA is yet to be determined. So for the APCA right now, it's mostly talking about text size, font size, font weight, and the color combinations. Icons do have a little bit of guidance, but those interactive states are TBD, to be determined.
All right, a popular question came through in several different people asking different ways. So they're acknowledging that yes, you've got a Figma plugin. Is there any other way outside of Figma to test this?
Yes. So if you actually just type into Google APCA calculator, my index, which is the company that is spearheading this entire APCA thing, they have their own calculator. And we're actually pulling their API into our plugin. So that's why I was saying, if the algorithm does change, the numbers might change on this presentation, but the plugin will be taking like the live API or basically like their database, making sure that we're up to date on things. So type in APCA calculator onto Chrome or Safari. It's probably like the first link, second link from my index. You type in 2 hex codes and it'll actually just give you the full range of font size and font weight.
Excellent. What about different languages? Do different languages have different contrast requirements, different characters?
That would be a great thing to kind of discuss. I don't have an answer for that personally, but you could think about it in the way of the font weight comes into play because of like the width of the characters, right? So if you do have languages that are maybe a smaller width to get a symbol, I'm thinking about like Japanese would be like a great example of what's going to happen when you're using that kind of language. How does that fall into, a font weight like we have for something like Helvetica? So I don't have an answer to that, but that's going to be a great discussion going forward.
That is a good question. What about color combinations that for some people seem to cause visual vibrations like red and green or some of those difficult ones?
I had this same question the last time I presented, I think. It's a really good point. So like hue is going to come into play for the APCA. It's a nominal effect, yes, but there are actually some color combinations that are kind of like looked at more thoroughly. Right off the top of my head, I know like blue backgrounds are going to be a little bit lower on the LC scale. So we have to be a little bit cautious with the cooler looking colors. Warmer colors, you get a little bit more leeway actually. So when it comes to like the vibration, that one's really tough because it always depends on like the monitor. It depends on like your refresh rate. But I think that is kind of the purpose of incorporating the hue into the APCA. It's not going to have such a drastic effect that all of a sudden red green is completely out, but it is going to give a little bit more guidance of like, hey, because you're using this color combination, you're going to have a little bit more contrast compared to something like the white on black or gray on white.
Yeah, and I would think that exact combination red and green would be out of bounds anyway because they're kind of similar luminosity.
Yeah, really depends on like what color or like what shade of green. Yeah.
All right, another question about the legality. Is it possible to use, or is there some sort of a patent or trademark or copyright on the algorithm, or can it just be used without legal repercussions?
That one I do not know. That one is a question for my index. But I did talk to someone at my index. I know when it comes to like the thought and idea about accessibility is like it needs to be for everybody. It's like the 3-point seatbelt that Volvo created way back in the day. They didn't put a patent on it because they knew it would benefit, everybody. So I doubt they're going to be looking for a patent. Hopefully nobody tries to put a patent on this algorithm. The entire purpose of accessibility is like, inclusivity, make it available for everybody. Yeah. But no, I don't have a personal answer to the legality issue.
All right, quick question, hopefully with a quick answer. What's your cat's name?
Oh, her name is Ophelia. I love these questions. I got her name from Pan's Labyrinth. She's like the princess of the underworld, and my little cat's a little tuxedo, and I just call her like my little princess. So I named her Ophelia.
All right. And the last question that we're going to have time for is there any color that will always fail, just no matter what, with this new algorithm?
No, which is good and bad, but good. In my last talk, like I ranted for a good 5 minutes about the color yellow because I don't like it. It's really hard to find, like good contrast with yellow. So with the APCA now, like you can still find good ways to use yellow. So like there's not going to be one color that is just like completely out of the picture. There's always going to be a way to use it so long as you're using it the right way with the font weight and the font size. So it's honestly like a big win in terms of like, there's no color that is now taboo.
All right. And that's all we have time for in the questions. There are discussions you can have on Discord with the AXCON channel there. So we appreciate you tuning in about this conversation about demystifying this new color contrast.